Okay, welcome all. So the Sicha this week is a Sicha, or another Rashi Sicha, as we have been doing most of the weeks, where we're going to focus on a Rashi and see what insights the Rabbi teaches us about it. So let's share the screen. And here we go. Okay, so let's start off by reading some of this week's parsha. This is the beginning, chapter 41. We're going to go down to verse, here we go, verse 39. So this is after Yosef has cracked the nut and he has proven himself to be the only genius in the entire Egypt who is capable of interpreting accurately Paro's dream. Last year, we learned the Sicha, also a Rashi Sicha, where the Rebbe delves a little deeper into that as to what was so genius. Isn't it obvious that fat cows and fat kernels and stalks growing from the Nile, like it's obviously related to seven and food, and skinny cows should be famine. You know, it seems obvious, and the Rebbe has some tremendous insights into that. We studied that last year. And I'm happy to send anybody the recording if you would like to follow up with that. And then Paro is very impressed, and so he proclaims as follows. So then Paro said to Yosef, since God has let you know all of this, there is no one as understanding and as wise as you. So therefore, you shall be appointed over my household, and through your command all my people shall be nourished. Only the throne will be greater than you. Will I make greater than you, right? Paro said to Yosef, look, I have appointed you over the entire land of Egypt. Paro removed his ring from his hand and placed it on Yosef's hand. We're familiar with that concept from the story of Purim, where Achashverosh removes his ring and gives it to Haman, and we know what that means. That is a ritual also, which means that the receiver of the ring is now promoted to the status of Mishnah Lamelech, second to the king. He tied him with a raiment of linen and placed the golden chain around his neck. And he had him ride in his chariot of second rank, and they called out before him, this is the king's patron. There's some discussion of exactly what that Hebrew word, avrech, they're translating it as the king's patron. There's some discussion as to what exactly that means, which maybe we'll touch upon later, and pointing him over the entire land. Paro said to Yosef, I am Paro, and besides you, no one may lift his hand or his foot in the entire land of Egypt. Paro named Yosef Tzafnas Paneach, which means the one who reveals the hidden, because he was able to decipher the meaning of the dream. And he gave him Asnas, the daughter of Potiphar, the governor of On, for a wife, and Yosef went forth over the land of Egypt. Yosef was then 30 years old. Okay. 7 years of plenty, the inhabitants of the land gathered food by the handfuls. And I'm going to ask, thank you, Hudi. I'm going to ask that please do not use the chat because I have to monitor it myself. If you want to say something, unmute yourself and say what you want to say. That's just easier in this context. Okay, so they collect the food, and Yosef gathers food like the sand of the sea in great abundance. They couldn't even keep count of how much food they had. Okay, and then we have the years of plenty finished. The years of famine begin. And then look at verse 55. It says, the entire land of Egypt hungered, and the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Yosef, what he tells you, do. Again, not the best translation. Let's read the pasuk ourselves and translate word for word, because this is the pasuk that we're going to be focusing on primarily. The entire land of Mitzrayim is hungry. They cry out to Paro for food. Paro says to all of Egypt, go to Yosef. Asher yoymar lochem, what he will tell you in the future tense, what he will tell you. and you may translate it also as whatever he will tell you. What he will tell you, or whatever he will tell you, you shall do. And so, indeed, the famine continues to spread, and Yosef ends up being the only supplier of food, and that, of course, we know the story that leads to his brothers coming to find him, etc. Okay, so so before we look at the Rashi, does anybody, just from the narrative, the way the Torah presents it, does anything seem to be amiss? Anybody here? Or anybody on the Zoom? Unmute yourself. Does anybody thinking about this story disturb you, or to feel like there's a part missing?
I say no.
Bob says no. He knows that's what I want him to say, because then I'll be, ooh, you see what we figured out over here. Okay. However, okay, so now let's switch on the Rashi. If we go to the top of the page, we get to switch on the Rashi. We'll go back down to verse 45. Sorry, 55. Okay, so the entire land of Egypt became hungry, for the grain which they had stored had decayed, except that of Joseph. Rashi's quoting here from Medrash Tanchuma that says that why was everybody suddenly hungry? Because they themselves, and why did they come crying to Pharaoh? Because they themselves had also had sort of kept their own private stashes of food, but apparently miraculously, all the food that they had stored had rotted, had become decayed and moldy, and Yosef was the only one who had any food left. And so they came running to Pharaoh asking for food, and Pharaoh told them, go to Yosef and do whatever he tells you to do. Says Rashi, since Yosef had ordered them to circumcise themselves, so they came. Then when they came to Pharaoh and said, this is what he told us to do, Pharaoh said to them, well, why didn't you gather your own grain? Didn't he announce to you that years of famine were coming? And they replied, yes, we did gather much grain, but it all rotted. It all decayed. So Pharaoh replied, if so, then you better do whatever he tells you, because if he issues a decree upon the grain and it rotted, what if he issues a decree upon us and we die? And again, this is a quote from Medrash Tanchuma. Okay, so Rashi is you may even say superimposing onto the narrative over here, a very elaborate story, which at face value does not seem to have any indication to it in the literal text of the Chumash, that Yosef was telling them to circumcise themselves. They clearly were not happy with this idea, and they came to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, well, if he has the supernatural powers to cause whatever we privately stashed, or whatever you privately stashed, to rot, then better not take any chances. He may decree that we all die, and so you better just get the food from him, and if he demands that you circumcise yourselves, then do that. And as you can imagine, the first and most important question that's going to astonish us over here is, that we're gonna have to address, is what was missing from the narrative that Rashi sees it necessary to tell us this story. Now, of course, Rashi didn't, quote, make this up. Rashi's quoting the Medrash. However, we've discussed many times that Rashi's job is, Rashi's stated goal in his commentary is to teach us Pshutei Shel Bikra, to teach us the literal meaning of the Torah, of the psukim, of the narrative. And there are different levels, Pshat, Remesh, Drush, there are different disciplines with which we can engage in the study of Torah, and never the twain shall meet. In other words, we don't overlap in between the different disciplines. And just like in a rule of science may or may not be applicable when you're studying art, when we're studying the Pshat, which is Rashi's stated goal, the Medrash is not really relevant unless the Pshat itself, the literal understanding of the narrative, has a gap. There's something missing, and we need to sort of start looking around for other resources to fill that gap. That is then and only then can we tap into Medrash to interpret the literal meaning. And even then, Rashi says it has to be Dover Loifnav. It has to be a Medrash that has some sort of jive. It fits with the literal meaning of the pasuk. It can't be a Medrash that's completely superimposed with no room within the text itself to at least allude or give place for it. So with all of that in mind, again, looking at this story that Rashi imposes onto the narrative over here seems completely out of place. The narrative read very well without it. Why does Rashi need to add all of this? And why does Rashi need to add all of this? And how does it lend itself into the narrative, like we just said? Okay. Now, there's of course many finer tuned and detailed questions in the Rashi, which we'll get to later. But let's first look at the story itself. Rashi is saying that Yosef told the Egyptians that they should circumcise themselves, and because they were not happy with this, they came to Paro. Now, why would Yosef want to say that? What would Yosef seek to accomplish? More than, obviously, we don't think that Yosef is just a petty, control freak trying to use his, manipulate people for no reason. Why would Yosef want to? Why would Yosef want to do this? To impose upon the Egyptians to circumcise themselves. What's that to be accomplished through this? And actually, the question is more than just sort of curious. Why would Yosef want to do this? There would seem to be a very clear reason why it would not be a good idea for Yosef to tell the Egyptians to circumcise themselves.
Abraham did the same thing, didn't he?
Go on.
Didn't Abraham do the same thing? He had some people that were around him, and he had them circumcised too.
Amazing. David Yehuda, you're really jumping ahead over here. Yes, very good point. We will get to that. But let's I want to first present another relevant piece to the discussion over here. By the way, I should point out, in various Sepharim there are, and commentaries on this Medrash, there are many reasons that are suggested why Yosef wanted them to circumcise. The one that I recall offhand is that he knew that the trajectory over here was that the Jewish people were going to end up living in Mitzrayim, and he didn't want them to have to be unnecessarily different than everyone else. He wanted to make their transition into the Egyptian society easier. They shouldn't have another thing that they could be harassed about for being backward or different, or whatever it was. So it was sort of another way to make his brothers and the Jewish people have a comfortable stay in Egypt. Either way, but there are other reasons also given. Again, I'm not familiar with all of them offhand, but again, for the context of for the purpose of our conversation, we need to find the reason that Yosef wanted them to circumcise, which is in line with Pshutei Shamikra, which is in line with Rashi's discipline of studying the literal meaning of the pasuk. Now, let us look at Parshas Noach. If we go to Parshas Noach, chapter 9, verse 4 and 5. Okay? Flesh with its soul, its blood, you shall not eat. Right? So that you're not allowed to eat the blood of the animals. And then it says, but your bloods of your souls, I will demand an account. From the hand of every beast I will demand it, from the hand of man, from the hand of each man his brother I will demand the soul of man. So it talks here about not spilling one's own blood, which in the context of halacha, hi Rabbi Epstein, I'm just going to mute you, nothing personal. Which in the context of halacha, it's probable or certainly possible that the context of spilling your own blood means suicide. But from the perspective of Pshutei Shel Mikra, of the literal meaning of the pasuk, it says, "You shall not spill your own blood," which appears to be a prohibition against inflicting wounds on oneself. And that being the case, we understand a very important. There's a question asked, completely unrelated to this topic, and that is, we know that in the beginning, at the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, Hashem tells Avram Avinu that it's time that he should circumcise himself. And the question is asked, well, we know that Avram Avinu kept the entire Torah even prior to it being given at Sinai. He kept all the mitzvahs, even Erev Tavshilin, even rabbinic enactments he kept. So why did he not circumcise himself beforehand? And there are many different answers offered to this question. What is the answer to that question from a Pshutei Shel Mikra perspective? Again, from the perspective of the literal meaning of the psukim, we know already in the literal meaning of the psukim that the Avis kept the Torah. Yaakov explicitly says, "Tarek mitzvahs shamarti," that he kept the mitzvahs. So why did Avram not circumcise himself before he was given the mitzvah until he was 99 years old? So one of the answers given, again, from addressing it from a Pshutei Shel Mikra perspective, is precisely because of this verse right here. That means, when we say that Avraham Avinu, that the forefathers kept the Torah, obviously they weren't obligated to do so. And yet what we mean is that they chose to do so on an optional level, on a volunteer basis. They opted in to doing things which they weren't obligated to do. They didn't have to wear tzitzis, they didn't have to wear tefillin, they didn't have to shake lulav, erev tafshil, and any of these things, but they did them anyway on a voluntary basis. Now, it's sort of self-evident that you can only volunteer to do something which is in the realm of optional. You have things that you have to do, you have things that you're not allowed to do, and then you have everything in the middle, which are things that you may or may, you can choose whether or not you want to do them. So your choice only pertains to those things in the middle category. So, for example, is somebody prior to Matan Torah allowed to sit in the sukkah on Sukkos? Sure, you could. There's nothing wrong with that. And so Avraham Avinu opted in to sit in the sukkah to keep that mitzvah, even though he was not yet required to do so. But when we say, but if something would be forbidden to do for somebody to do, then you can't say, oh, well, I'm going to be extra pious and do something that I'm forbidden to do. So one of the other examples for this is Yaakov marrying two sisters. We know that Yaakov married two sisters, and the question is, well, how could you marry two sisters if one of the mitzvahs that the Torah forbids such a relationship? And the answer is, again, from the Pshutei Shel Mikra perspective, is that Yaakov had a commitment. He had committed to Rachel that he was going to marry her. So what was he going to do now? And say, I'm sorry, I made a commitment, but I'm going to break my commitment to you because I have a personal chumrah that I like to keep the Torah? Obviously, you can't do that. So the same is true with Avraham Avinu, that all the other mitzvahs that he did, he was allowed to do. There was no reason for him not to do them. But the mitzvah of circumcision was forbidden for him to do because the Torah explicitly says, and this is in Parshas Noach, this is even before Avraham Avinu, that one of the Noachide mitzvahs incumbent upon Avram and incumbent upon everyone is not to spill your own blood, which again, from a Pshutei Shel Mikra perspective, means that you shall not inflict a wound upon yourself. And so until Avraham Avinu received an explicit commandment from God to circumcise himself, it was forbidden for him to do so. Okay, now let's import the relevance of that into our story over here. Yosef is telling the Egyptians to circumcise themselves. But why? First of all, like we said before, what was he seeking to accomplish? But even more than that, based on the verse that we just saw in Parshas Noach, which is incumbent upon all descendants of Noach, upon all Noachites, including all of the Egyptians, there was actually an explicit prohibition in the Torah against circumcising themselves by virtue of that being a self-inflicted wound. So what was going on over here? Why did Yosef want to do this? And so in order to understand this, we need to look back at something else. Let's go to Parshas Lech Lecha, where the mitzvah of circumcision is introduced to Avraham Avinu. So here, Avraham Avinu is 99 years old. Hashem tells you, okay, I'm going to make the covenant between me and you, multiply you very greatly. You're going to be the father of multitude of nations. Your name will be Avraham. And look at this. I will establish my covenant between you, between me and between you, and between your seed after you throughout the generations as an everlasting covenant. So the Torah says that what Hashem is about to say to Avraham Avinu is not only to him personally, but to his children and descendants and everlasting for generations to come. I will give you your seed after you the land. And again over here, I shall keep my covenant, you and your seed after you throughout the generations. What is the covenant? Every male among you shall be circumcised. Which males need to be circumcised? So verse 12 over here says, every male shall be circumcised to you throughout the generations, one that is born in your house or one that is purchased with money. From any foreigner, even if he is not your seed. Those born in the house and those purchased for money shall be circumcised. And then indeed, later on in the end of this chapter, we see that he took all of those born into his house and all of those purchased with money, every male from the people of Avram's household, and he circumcised the flesh of the foreskin on that day as God had spoken with him. Okay, is this what you're referring to, David?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the Rebbe presents the case that Yosef, as a descendant of Avram, was obligated to see to it that everyone that is, quote, owned by him, anyone who he has ownership over, and again, perhaps nowadays we're a bit allergic to that terminology, right? But talking about slavery and ownership, anybody who Yosef has jurisdiction and ownership over, he ought to see to it that they circumcise themselves because that's part of the mitzvah of bris milah. Now let's review this parak that we were just looking at and talk about what is the position, what is the position of the status of the relationship between Yosef and the subjects, the subjects of Egypt, right? They were all under him. So let's look at some of that detail. Let's read it, how specific and how overarching his authority over everybody else was. Through your command, all my people shall be nourished. Only the throne will I make greater than you. What does it mean, only the throne I will make greater than you? So Rashi says that the only difference between me and you is that I will be called king. So basically, in other words, Yosef is called second to the king. That's his title, and only Paro is called the king. But in essence, there ain't really no difference between Yosef and Paro. Yosef is also has the power of king, except he just can't be called king. That's what Rashi seems to be saying over here. And he tells him, I've appointed you over the entirety of Egypt. He gives him the ring. And then look at this one. He says, okay, so we had this term, he makes him a patron, which we discussed, that there's some discussion as to exactly what the status of Avrich is. But look at verse 44. It says, I am Paro, besides you, no one may lift his hand or his foot in the entire land of Egypt. What does it mean that you're not allowed to lift your hand or your foot? Rashi says, as the Targum renders it. What does it mean? That no man shall raise his hand to bear arms, nor his foot to ride a horse. So even to have any sort of movement or organization, I don't know if it obviously doesn't, to get a permit for concealed carry, to bear arms, to ride a horse, to have any type of organization or movement or arrangement or anything, you had to get the permission of Joseph. You weren't a free man to do any of these things. I mean, this is the big debate in modern politics in this country about the right to bear arms, right? But even that, quote, basic right was limited. You had to have it was under Joseph's jurisdiction. Now, so Yosef is everything but a king. Now, the truth is that later on in Parshas Vayechi, is this it? Hold on. Yeah, in the beginning of Parshas Vayechi, we have Yosef coming in to visit his father, and it says that Yisrael, that's Yaakov, his father, prostrated himself on the head of the bed. Why did he prostrate himself? So Rashi explains that he was thanking. One of the interpretations is that he was thanking for the fact that all of his children were devout servants of God. And he says over here, as is evidence of the fact that Yosef, who was a king, and furthermore he was captured among the heathens, and yet he remained steadfast in his righteousness. But Rashi, parenthetically here, uses the term to describe Yosef as being a king, right? In addition, early on in this chapter, the end of Parshas Mikeitz, and then Parshas Vayigash, we find Yosef moving everybody around, and he relocates people again. He moves people from one. He forcefully moves people from one area in Egypt to the other. Everybody has to resettle. So again, all of this goes to further underscore the absolute jurisdiction that Yosef had. And so, based on all of this, based on this understanding of Yosef's relationship with the people of Egypt and his absolute sovereignty over them, it's perfectly reasonable to say, and certainly from a Pshutish Mikra perspective, that Yosef was obligated, based on the idea that anyone that is under your jurisdiction, that belongs to you, you have to circumcise. That Yosef had a mitzvah to circumcise all of the Egyptians. Now, just a note is that even from a halachic perspective, there is some discussion as to, according to some opinions at least, the king has ownership over the people of the land. There is a concept called Dina de Malchus Dina, that according to Torah, the law of the land is the law. And if the king if I choose to tax you, that's called theft, right? I don't have any right to steal your money. But if the king of the land chooses to tax you, that's not theft. The king has a right to take your money. Why does he have the right to take your money? That's under the principle of Dina de Malchus Dina. Why is Dina de Malchus Dina? Where does the king get the right to do this? So that's a discussion. There's various opinions and reasons suggested why that is the case. But the Rambam, I just put this over here, hold on. The Rambam in Hilchos Gzeil Vaveda writes, the members of the nation, the people of that nation have relied on him, and they rely that he is their master, and they are his slaves. So whatever the word slaves means, we see that very same word, slaves, which is what gives you the obligation to circumcise somebody else if it's your slave, the Rambam uses that very same terminology to explain the mechanism of why it is that a king has financial jurisdiction over his subjects. And so from a Pshutish Mikra perspective, Yosef certainly had an obligation to do whatever he could that the Egyptians would circumcise themselves. And we could even suggest tentatively that even from a halachic perspective, which, like we've said before, is a different discipline than traditional mikra, but even from a halachic perspective, we could possibly suggest that Yosef had this obligation. And now, let's go back to reading this Rashi. And the whole narrative, right? So let's hide the Rashi. Let's read the Psukim again. So Paro appoints Yosef to be Alpicha Yishak Kakal Ami, that the entire, through your command, everybody should be nourished. So he is the minister of, I don't know if the word is finance, or the minister of produce. He's in charge of distributing the produce to the entire land of Egypt. Nobody's allowed to do anything without you. You're in charge, and everything goes by you. And he is the minister of Picha Yisha Kalami. Rashi says over here, everybody gets their sustenance through you, their nourishment through you. And so when we come to verse 55, and Rashi said, and it says that the entire land of Egypt hungered and the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. Before we even read any further, the question is, why did they come to him? Who are they supposed to go to if they're hungry? They're supposed to go to Yosef. Yosef is in charge of that. I've appointed, right? Why are they coming to Pharaoh? Pharaoh has appointed a minister over these things. And so, as is the way of the Psukim, and Rashi has told us this numerous other times, that often the Torah omits details of the story that are obvious. And so in this case, what's obvious is that if they're coming to Pharaoh to ask for food, they're not just coming to ask him for food, they've obviously already gone to Yosef. And there's something about what Yosef has said to them that they don't like, and that's why they're coming to Pharaoh. So even though the pasuk says that they're crying out to Pharaoh for bread, if we are to give, this is a mikra kotzer, but if we are to give a more precise description of what they were doing here, we would say they cried out to Pharaoh to intervene to Yosef that he give them bread. They're not coming to Pharaoh to ask him for bread. They know Yosef is in charge of bread. They're coming to ask Pharaoh to intervene with Yosef. Why are they coming to ask him to intervene with Yosef? Because something about what Yosef said doesn't jive with them. They're not happy with it. Now, Rashi says, Lefi Shahaya Yosef Omenam Sheimolu. Because since Yosef, again, often the translation over here is paraphrased more than literal, and some of the detail gets lost in it. The literal translation is, because Yosef used to tell them to circumcise themselves, right? Rashi does not say that these words teach us that Yosef was telling them to circumcise themselves. It's not that somehow the words, do what Yosef tells you to do, alludes to the fact that Yosef was telling them to circumcise himself. The fact that Yosef would tell them to circumcise himself is a given fact that we know before this narrative. Obviously, Yosef tells them to, tries to get them to circumcise themselves. He's a devout Jew, and he's a descendant of Abraham, and he's trying to keep the mitzvah to get all his subjects to circumcise themselves. So it's obvious that that's what Yosef is trying to do. Now, we could also anticipate that when Yosef becomes appointed the viceroy of Egypt, and he now has even more, a very strong control over here, he is going to up his game. So now they're all coming to him to food, and now he has another bargaining chip. I'm trying to get you to circumcise. Well, now you need me. Now the famine started, and you really need me. Okay, now I'm going to up my game over here to try and get you to circumcise themselves. Again, nothing that we've said so far is what this pasuk is teaching me. All of this I ought to know before I encounter this pasuk. So now the pasuk says they come to Pharaoh. We know that they're not coming to Pharaoh to ask him for bread, because that they would go to Yosef for. So clearly they're coming to Pharaoh because they don't like what Yosef has said, and they're coming to Pharaoh to ask him to intervene. So now, before we read the next part of the discussion, the context, the lens through which we're going to look at this discussion is as a up and back, a to and fro between Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and Pharaoh is trying to explain to them or excuse to them his position that he is mixing out and he is not going to intervene. So he starts off by saying to them, why didn't you gather grain? Now, we know the back end. The back end is that they did gather grain and it miraculously rotted and decayed. Pharaoh also knows that. He's not asking them, why didn't you gather grain, because he doesn't know that information. He's asking that, he's putting the question to them to prove his point to them. He says they answer him, we did gather grain, but it all rotted. So Pharaoh is saying, okay, there you have your answer. You have your answer. Yosef has supernatural powers over here, so of course I'm not going to intervene. Nothing that I can do is going to make any difference. But Pharaoh is not finished yet, because he wants to really prove his case strongly. He really wants to impress upon the Egyptian nation that not only is there no point in him intervening, because if there's no point, well, they could counter and say, well, okay, well, you have nothing to lose. Why don't you try? And Pari doesn't even want to try. He doesn't want to mix in at all because he says there is something to lose. Not only is there nothing to gain, there is something to lose. What's there to lose? Because he might decree upon us that we die. Again, this is one of the questions in the Sikha. Why does he need to add this whole thing? Pari could have just said, look, you're coming to me to ask for bread because Yosef, if you understand this Rashi before we learned the Sikha, we thought they were coming to Pari to ask for bread. And Pari tells them, go to Yosef. He's the ultimate guy in charge. He even causes your food to rot. So obviously you have to go to him. You've got no other choice. But now what the Rebbe has done is he's switched the whole context of the conversation. It's not about the asking Pari for bread. It's a discussion where they're trying to convince Pari to intervene with Yosef, and Pari is arguing to them that it's pointless, but not only pointless, it can be counterproductive. And that's why he finishes and he adds, first of all, it's pointless. But not only is it pointless, it's even counterproductive because he may even decree upon us that we die. In other words, if he doesn't like it, if I, Pari, try to use my power against him and say, look, Yosef, you really have to do this, then, he's nothing standing in the way of Yosef carrying out his agenda. And so Yosef may decree that we all die, and therefore not only is there nothing to lose, but it's a really bad idea for me to intervene. And that's also why I alluded to this before. If you look in the pasuk, it says, Asher Menachem tasu, you should do what he tells you. But Rashi, when he quotes those words, he adds the word kol, which means not just you should do what he tells you, you should do whatever he tells you. And it doesn't say whatever he tells you, which is how the English translates it, but it's actually in the future, whatever he will tell you. In other words, Pari is really telling them, look, you have to do whatever this man will tell you. Whatever he comes up with, you better listen to him because there's no other way. He has demonstrated by miraculously causing the tvua, the grain, to decay. He has demonstrated that he has absolute power, and therefore not just what he tells you, but whatever, anything that he tells you, and not just that he has already told you, namely to circumcise, but whatever he may tell you in the future, make sure to keep his command because the alternative is not going to be good news. That is basically the gist of the Sikha. We will learn the end of the Sikha where the Rebbe teaches us what the lesson in our service, in our Aveda, in our service of God is. But I just want to add, if we look at some of the footnotes of the Sikha, there's an interesting thing. So in footnote 15, the Rebbe asks a question. The Rebbe says, we know when it comes to the story of Shechem, which we learned a few weeks ago, so the brothers, the Shvatim, tell Chamoir and Shechem that the condition for them to join into one nation is that all of the people of Shechem circumcise themselves. Now, but we established that one of the Noachide mitzvahs is not to inflict a wound upon yourself. So how come Shimon and Levi were telling them to circumcise themselves and thereby violate the mitzvah? Now, the answer to that question is obvious. This was all they held, Shimon and Levi held, and we can discuss whether they were justified or not, but Shimon and Levi held that these people were chayiv misa, they were liable to death. Either there's different reasons given, either because they neglected to bring Shechem to justice and Chamer to justice, as the Rambam says, or the Ramban says that in general they were very they didn't keep their responsibilities to the 7 Noachide laws, and so this was all part of the ruse, is that the word, to trick them into circumcising themselves so that they become weak and they would be able to kill them. So it's no question how were Shimon and Levi allowed to tell them to circumcise themselves. But the question is, Shechem should have used his noodles and think, hey, hold on a second. One of the Noachide laws is that you're not allowed to wound yourself. Why are they telling us to wound ourselves? Obviously, they must be trying to put in some trick over here. So how come Shechem and Chamer did not see through that? So that is the question that the Rebbe asks in R15, and he doesn't answer the question there. But then later on in the footnote 27 of this Sikha, in footnote 24 of this Sikha, the Rebbe says that part of the deal, so to speak, that Shimon and Levi pretended to be brokering with the people of Shechem was in the words of Shechem to his people. Let's look this up inside Genesis 34:16. So this is, with this, however, we will consent if you will be like us, that every male will be circumcised, then we'll give you our daughters, and we will take your daughters, we will dwell with you and become one people. And so too that's when Shimon and Levi are talking to Shechem and Hamor, and then when a few psukim later, when Shechem and Hamor are conveying the message to the people of Shechem, again they talk about that we're going to become one people. And so it could be, it makes sense that everybody knows that if you want to become part of the people of Abraham, you have to circumcise yourself. And we know that the mitzvah of circumcision wasn't only for Yitzchak and his descendants. Yishmael and his descendants also had the mitzvah of circumcision. In fact, the Rambam holds that the descendants of Yishmael till today are obligated to circumcise themselves. And so we know that Shimon and Levi were telling them to circumcise themselves as a trick to get them, that they would be weak and they would be vulnerable and they would be able to overcome the whole city of Shechem. But why did Shechem and Hamor not see through the trick? And that's because they assumed that this was part of the condition to become one people, was that they were joining into the people of Abraham and thereby had the mitzvah of Mina. Now let us turn to the end of the Sikha, where the Rabbi tells us what the lesson in Avodas Hashem from this whole story is. And again, here you have on the Project Likute Sichos website, you have the entire Sikha translated into English, and you can certainly review it, and there's many other resources as we've discussed in the past. Okay. Rashi's interpretation here also includes the wine of Torah. So the wine of the Torah is the terminology that the Rebbe used, borrowed from the Alter Rebbe. The lesson, just like wine, the Alter Rebbe says in Torah, that wine, or in the Torah, that wine is something that you have to work hard to bring. Grapes are just grapes, and then you work hard, and you're able to bring out the potential of the grapes to become this sophisticated wine. So the same is true with the Rashis, that when we really dig deeply into Rashi, we're able to produce deep stuff. In several places, Chassidus explains that the distinction between Yosef and his brothers, since Yosef was a Merkava of Atzilus, a chariot of Atzilus, worldly matters were insignificant to him and did not distract him whatsoever. So why is it that Yosef, specifically of all the brothers, was able to be unaffected by Mitzrayim, as we saw before in the pasuk when in the beginning of Vayechi, when Yosef wants to be blessed, when Yaakov is going to bless them, and he points out that Yosef was a king and he was captured among the nations and he remained steadfast in the righteousness. That was something which was unique to Yosef, and the other Shvatim, they remained sheltered. They preoccupied themselves with shepherding flock. They remained sheltered. And Yosef was a chariot of Atzilus. What a chariot of Atzilus means is that there is the reality of Atzilus and there's the reality of the lower worlds. I think many people on the class today are familiar or have some familiarity with the very beginning of Tanya, chapter 2, where the Alter Rebbe talks about different levels of neshamas. What's the different levels of neshamas? You have a neshama of Atzilus and you have a neshama of lower levels. So imagine, perhaps a mashal for that is, somebody has to travel from the United States to, let's say, to Israel, right? So Israel is the destination. Now, he may have a stopover in France, right? Now, there's different levels of stopover. He could just have the plane landing to refuel. He could have to get out and switch planes. He could have to get out in France and sleep overnight to wait for his connection. And he might even have a free stopover where he hangs out in France for 2 months and goes touring the country and learns the language and the culture and may even start feeling some sense of belonging to France, right? So that's a mashal for the neshama. All neshamas, the Alter Rebbe says in Perek Bais, start with Atzilus. Starting with Atzilus, what that means is that the neshama has the absolute realization and consciousness of the truth of God, and ipso facto the falsehood of everything else other than God, right? Then you have neshamas. So all neshamas start out over there. Me, you, and every single Jew, anybody who's born to a Jewish mother has that within them, within their neshama. But if you're a neshama of Yetzirah, that's one lower of Bria, that's one world lower than Atzilus, you didn't have a non-stop flight. You had a connection in France. A little bit, you might have been affected by France. In our narrative, France means some reality other than God. Maybe there is some truth or some meaning or some value in something other than God. And then most of us are those people all the way at the end that we got so sidetracked that we didn't even end up there getting our connection flight. We might have just stayed in France and become Frenchies, right? In other words, our neshamas have so forgotten about that original thing that they awareness that they have. Now, the difference between Yosef and his brothers is that Yosef is a Merkava of Atzilus, and wherever he is, he carries that awareness of Atzilus with him. Whereas his brothers, they run the risk of getting sidetracked by France. And therefore, if they want to remain steadfast in their faith, they need to make sure they only have direct flights. Okay, let's read that inside. Again, this is a free translation of Sichos. Yes, Ori.
Don't we say that Yosef was all into his gashmias and the way he looked?
Good question. Let's finish the Sicha first. In several places, Chassidus explains that the distinction between Yosef and his brothers, since Yosef was a chariot of Atzilus, worldly matters were insignificant to him and did not distract him whatsoever. This enabled him to serve as the ruler of Egypt, a place of ultimate spiritual lowliness, symbolizing the descent and the distraction of this physical world. Nevertheless, he remained in a state of absolute transcendence, cleaving to godliness. In contrast, his brothers, being a chariot of Bria, that's the next world down, needed to isolate from the physical world. For this reason, they chose to be shepherds, so that the concerns of the material world will not distract them from serving Hashem. Rashi's explanation above deepens our understanding. So Rashi, now, we know this already about Yosef, but now having learned this Rashi, we are able to have an even deeper understanding of what Yosef was accomplishing, being this Merkava of Atzilus and serving as the viceroy of Egypt. Not only did the concerns of this material world not distract Yosef from his bond with his service, to Hashem, but he was able to affect and influence the world beyond him. He even, in other words, when the neshama of Atzilus is here in this world, and he had his stopover in France, and his connecting flight was canceled, and he ends up spending 2 months in France, he's not affected one iota himself. But not only that, he even makes the people in France forget about France and remember about God. He even compelled the people of Egypt, the most depraved place in the world. Erev Ha'aretz, Mitzrayim, is known as the place to be completely invested in lowliness, to be circumcised and thereby subduing their culture of lewdness. And in the footnote here, the Rebbe refers to the Rambam in Mir Nevuchim, who says that the reason, or a reason for the mitzvah of circumcision, is because the mitzvah because circumcising oneself affects a decreased amount of pleasure or lust in this world. So circumcising Egypt means you're taking the people the Egyptians, who what they stand for is maximum pleasure, absolute worshiping lust and pleasure of this world, and making them circumcise themselves and recognize that there is a higher purpose to live for in this world than self-indulgence. And Yosef's efforts were effective to the extent that even Paro himself, the king of Egypt, commanded the Egyptians to obey Yosef and to circumcise themselves. And the Rebbe finishes off that from here we can derive a lesson for each of us. The Jewish people are referred to by the name Yosef, as the verse says, "No heik katsoin Yosef," that you lead Yosef like a sheep. Yosef in this case refers to the entire Jewish people. Therefore, just a second. Yep. Therefore, every single Jew has the ability to bring himself to the level of Yosef, no matter where he may be, even if the people around him are at a very low spiritual state. and are very distant from Judaism, right? So obviously we're not being like Yosef on the literal level of Neshama of Atzilus, but we can copy and paste and implement that that model into our personal life. That we have some awareness of God and of the truth of Torah, and hopefully we have an awareness of the truth of Torah that may be more than those around us. So thus, not only must the Jew not be intimidated by the materiality of society and not fall spiritually, but he must strengthen himself to be whole in all matters of Torah and mitzvahs. A Jew also has the ability to influence the outside world and all the Jews in his environment. His proper behavior will serve as a light into the nations, so that even the non-Jews will observe the 7 Noachide laws, leading to the rectification and refinement of the entire world. We will merit through this the coming of the righteous Mashiach and the fulfillment of the divine promise. I like to say the psukim in Hebrew. For then I will transform the people into a pure language, and that all of them call into the name of Hashem to worship Him of one accord. And may we be successful in this mission of implementing the paradigm and the example of Yosef into our personal lives. Hudi asked the question that how does the Hasidic description of Yosef's neshama fit with that which Rashi says in last week's parsha, that Yosef may have been a bit too engaged in his physical appearance and his physical wants, and that even may have caused him to go a bit far, almost go astray, or at least caused what was the impetus that why the wife of Potiphar even considered him a possible target for her desires. Offhand, I can't answer the question. It's a very interesting question, and I do want to look into it. But let's remember, anybody else, Rabbi Epstein has something to offer on that. How do we fit the Hasidic interpretation and the literal interpretation? As the Rebbe always says, that all the different facets of Torah have to, though they are different, they have to, they coexist and they complement each other. So obviously there is an answer to the question. I just don't know the answer offhand, and I'll research it. But if anybody else has something to say, we're all ears.
And maybe you could just speculate. I mean, it's a very good question.
Can you speak up a little bit, Rabbi?
It's a very good question because it seems to cut right to the heart of what we're saying here. So I will guess, this is a guess, that when Yosef is beautifying himself, it's not just a simplistic sense of, his own vanity, but it's the beauty of the Atzilus that is coming through. Like we know that the wife of Potiphar, really she intended this not just out of her own lust, but because she wanted to have offspring from Yosef, and she wanted to be with him even at a spiritual level in Olam Haba and so on. And so maybe that was the point. It wasn't really just pure vanity for his own appearance, but it was a spiritual beauty that they sensed, that even Paro sort of recognized it's the wisdom of Hashem and so on. That was startling to the Egyptians. They never saw that kind of holiness. But it's a very good question. I don't know. Maybe we'll have Yesh La'ayin.
All right. We will hopefully report back with a conclusive answer next week. Thank you all for joining us, and over and out.